Good evening, dear audience. We will be discussing today an important issue facing our society. You know, the Convention about Women's Rights, which we call Istanbul Convention because it was signed in the city of Istanbul, is being widely discussed. The public have many concerns and many questions. We are signing this convention as part of the Council of Europe. We're discussing it as part of the Council of Europe, of which we are a member. We have today in the room two representatives, a chair and deputy chair of two different commissions of the Council of Europe. We have Grevio President Marceline Naudin. Good evening, thank you for accepting the invitation. And I should say this commission is dealing with or combating violence against women. It's a group of experts that analyzes the reasons for violence and the ways of addressing violence. Veronika Vilkova, Venice Commission Vice President. Good evening, and thank you for accepting the invitation. So, as they say, first-hand information. What is the Istanbul Convention, and what's the purpose, please?
The Istanbul Convention is the Council of Europe Convention for the prevention and combating of violence against women and domestic violence. It's a Council of Europe Convention that was agreed by all of the Council of Europe member states, including Armenia, and it has one principal, clear objective, which is to fight against violence against women. That is it in a nutshell. I can talk some more about what it is not, if you wish me to.
So could you please elaborate a little?
So it's a convention, as I said, which was agreed by all of the Council of Europe member states. Countries have to sign and then ratify. Once they have ratified the convention, it means that they will abide by it, they will follow it, they will implement it and follow it. Within the convention, there are laws, there are services, there are policies, and we call them the 4 Ps, the letter P, because we say it is about prevention of violence against women, it is about protection for women and their children who have experienced or are experiencing violence, prevention, protection, prosecution of the perpetrator, and then finally policies, integrated policies. So we say that violence against women is unacceptable, domestic violence is unacceptable. We say that you need to have certain laws in place, like, for example, a law on stalking or sexual harassment. We say that you need to have services for the women, services like shelters for them to stay in if they are escaping violence, counseling to help them and their children, also services for the children to help them overcome the trauma that they have been through. You need also longer term services so that the women will then have to move out of shelters and move into accommodation. They will need housing, they might need training for jobs, for employment, etc.
Why does it include the term gender? Why?
It includes the term gender because as has been said in many international documents, which Armenia is also part of, violence against women and inequalities between women and men, which is known as gender inequality, feed into each other. Violence against women makes women less equal. Inequality increases violence against women. So they feed into each other. So the convention is clear about this, and it says that we also need to look at our societies generally. We need to look at ways in which women in our society are considered inferior in any way to men, and we need to work to remove anything which makes women inferior, or which projects, which perceives women as inferior in a society. Women inferior to men, they should be equal, not inferior. So to do that, it gives a clear definition of gender in the convention. And the definition of gender is that, I'm not quoting it word for word, but it's saying that gender does not replace sex. There is a man and there is a woman and there is sex. But gender is about the cultural expectations, the roles, and
Is that so clear in the convention, that there's a man and there is a woman and there is sex, and that gender does not replace sex? Is that clear? It doesn't introduce a new sex.
Do you want to chip in there?
I may. I think it's obvious even from the title of the convention, because it speaks explicitly about the violence against women. So it's quite clear already from the title that the division between men and women is in no way questioned in the convention, and states are in no way expected to change their legislation, including the constitution, recognizing the existence of men and women. As rightly noticed, there is this difference between sex on the one hand and gender on the other hand. And while sex refers to biological differences between men and women, and that is fully recognized in the convention, gender refers to social expectations linked
norms,
to the roles of men and women. And states are not expected and not requested to do any changes with respect to the division of to the sex differences.
Can I just add to that a little bit? So for me, when we're talking about gender equality, what we're talking about is, for example, if you are a man, our society tells us you have to be brave, you have to be strong, you are the leader. If you are a woman, our society tells us you have to be fragile, kind, caring, nurturing. Good things. I'm not saying they are bad things, but I'm telling you that I am a woman and I can be kind and caring and nurturing, but I can also be strong. I can also be a leader. And you are a man.
We have lots of examples of such women.
Yes, and you are a man, you can be strong and brave, but you can also be kind and caring and nurturing. You can look after a baby as well as I can look after a baby, for example. And I can be in Parliament, for example. You have many women in Parliament, as much as you can be in Parliament.
But it's important, if I may.
But look, we talk about violence against women, right? The critics have said, we don't get it. Why is the convention needed? Our domestic law actually condemns violence and provides for penalties. And on the level of national law, we've dealt with this problem. What are we going to get from this convention? What else are we going to get if we accept that violence against women is not okay? And yes, we punish, we penalize it. Why do we need this extra convention?
To start with, you have a law and that is very good. However, you still have the violence. You still have women in your country, as we have in all the countries, who are experiencing violence. You still have women who are killed, murdered by their spouses, husbands, whatever. You still have them.
And you think after the convention it's going to stop?
I think that the convention, which was drafted by experts and all of the Council of Europe, representatives of all of the Council of Europe countries, including Armenia, is based on very good practices, is based on the experience of all of the countries. They all participated, they all contributed, and they came up with this convention. The law that you have is fine, But the convention, as I said, goes beyond the law. So the convention says you have to have the laws, which you have, which is very good. But the convention also says you need so many bed spaces for women and their children who are escaping violence. You need so many shelters. You need them not only in the capital, you need them all over the country. So the convention says the state has to make sure that you have these things. So if there is a woman who looks for help, she will find it. The woman might go to the police, which is good, but might not go to the police. You need a 24-hour helpline. You need to have counseling services, as I said, for the women, for the children. You need, and the convention mentions all these things. So it goes beyond the law. It talks about the law, which is very important, but it goes beyond the law. That is one thing. And Petros, it's very important that we remember that this is about women experiencing violence. If there is a woman out there who is listening to this program, who is living in a situation of violence, of abuse, and when we say violence, we don't just mean physical violence, we mean emotional violence, economic violence, sexual violence, that she has somewhere to go, that she can pick up a phone and get help, and that help will not tell her, well, I'm sorry, we have no beds, that help will send her somewhere safe. So this is what we're talking about. Now, no, of course, the convention is not perfect. We have no perfect society that I know of so far. If I find one, I will tell you. But so far, I have not encountered any perfect society where there are no problems, where these are not issues. However, what we can do is try to minimize. It will not disappear. I wish it would, but it will not. But we can try to minimize, and we can try to protect the women who are experiencing these things. Because it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to have these things. We need to prevent, we need to protect, we need to prosecute, we need to have policies which puts everything together.
Well, Mrs. Audi, by and large, in our society, nobody is opposed to this. The talk really is about some hidden threats, and we'll get to that. But before we get there, very famous Armenian lawyers, former Minister of Justice, for instance, are actively writing posts that this convention contradicts the constitution of the Republic of Armenia. Venice has recently become the main interpreter of our constitution. So, Mrs. Bilkova, is there a contradiction between this and our constitution or not?
Indeed, the Venice Commission has adopted an opinion assessing the compatibility of the Istanbul Convention with the Constitution of Armenia. We did not do it out of our own initiative. We did it at the request of Armenia, of the Ministry of Justice. And at the same time, obviously, we are not an authoritative interpreter of the Armenian constitution. It's up to the Constitutional Court to give the final assessment. But we did what we usually do, and we came to the conclusion that the Constitution of Armenia and the Istanbul Convention are fully compatible. There is no incompatibility, no contradiction between the two instruments.
Great. One of the most important problems is the notion of family. As far as I understand, the convention refers to a family environment also as partners, who in our traditional understanding aren't a family. How does the convention cover that notion of family, please? That's really one of our main criticism points of one of our opponents. Does that not undermine our traditional family? Does it not jeopardize it, or is it not going to be a first step in that direction?
There are a lot of misunderstandings about the convention, and this is one of them. It's supposed that the convention gives some definition of a family, which is not so. The Istanbul Convention does not propose any definition of family. It mentions family in a couple of instances, but it leaves it up to individual states to provide their own definition of a family, because the definition obviously might be different in different countries of the Council of Europe. So it's up to the national legislator, up to each individual country to use its own definition of family. There is no definition imposed by the Istanbul Convention.
I will add something to that. You said that for you, family is a married couple and children, presumably, or not children, but that is a family. The Istanbul Convention protects women in that situation, absolutely. However, if I have a boyfriend, I'm a bit old now, but when I was younger, if I had a boyfriend, not yet married, maybe engaged, and he beats me up, the convention will still protect me. Yeah? Do you see what I mean? So in that sort of situation, that man can be called my partner. If we are not married, but if he abuses me, it's still domestic violence, yeah? If he is my boyfriend.
But that would not mean that you would need to include this under the definition of family,
No.
that you would need to change the definition of family.
No, absolutely not.
Well, that's not really that case that you described. It's about homosexual, same-sex families, because there are people in our country that live that together they're not registered in the civil agency.
Clearly, as has been explained by my colleague here, Veronica, in the convention, family is not defined so that the Armenian state and any other state can keep their definition of family. So because
It's defined in our constitution, families between a man and a woman.
there it is then. That is why the convention does not define it, so that you can keep your definition as it is defined.
Let me address directly this question about same-sex marriage, because that's another misunderstanding when something is read into the convention which is not really there. So the convention does not mention same-sex marriage at all. In fact, it does not even speak about marriage as such. It only mentions marriage in one context, and that's forced marriage, when someone is obliged to marry someone. Yeah, so it's mentioned only in this context as an example of a bad practice. But the concept of same-sex marriage is not present in the Istanbul Convention, which obviously also means that the Istanbul Convention does not impose any obligations in this respect. So, for instance, sometimes it is argued that countries which ratify the Istanbul Convention need to legalize same-sex marriage. That is not so. There is no obligation in this respect in the convention, and the practice confirms it. Nowadays, we have 34 countries which have ratified the Istanbul Convention, which is already quite a big number. Some of them have the institution of same-sex marriage. Many of them included this institution into their legal order prior to the ratification of the Istanbul Convention. But no country which has ratified the Istanbul Convention has been obliged, has been forced to legalize same-sex marriage. And in fact, we have countries which are state parties to the Istanbul Convention, and where same-sex marriage is not a legal institution, for instance, Italy or Serbia. So it's very well compatible to be a state party to the Istanbul Convention and not to recognize same-sex marriage.
Thank you. Then, how is the convention related to sexual orientation? Is it not, in a hidden way, promoting homosexuality, protecting their rights, preparing ground for their rights? You're surprised, right? You look surprised. But this week there was a demonstration about that.
We know that there is this suspicion of a hidden agenda in the convention, but the same that we have been describing for family and for same-sex marriage actually applies here, because sexual orientation and gender identity are again concepts which are not really covered by the Istanbul Convention. They are mentioned in a single provision which relates to discrimination. That means that any feature, including sexual orientation, but also age, wealth, birth, etc., may not be the ground for the discrimination when you already fall under the scope of the application of the convention. But the convention does not speak about these institutions apart from this provision. So again, there is, for instance, no obligation to recognize, the third gender or have a special legislation on transsexuals. There is nothing like that in the convention, which obviously is linked to its title and to its purpose. The convention is about the combat against violence of women. So it focuses on this topic, on eradicating violence against women, and there is no reason why it should mention other institutions.
Very well, I understand. So if the convention is such a great thing, they say, and it's so favorable and so good, why is it that a number of member states of the EU don't ratify it? Bulgaria is always often cited, the Bulgarian Constitutional Court having refused. Why?
If it is such a great convention, well, if it is not such a great convention, to use the opposite argument with you, why is it that so many of the member states have ratified it? Are they all not right in the head? So many have ratified it and are happy to have ratified it and are telling us, because the Grevio also monitors countries' implementation. And we go to monitor and they tell us, we are so glad that we have the convention. So why is it, do you think, that so many countries have ratified it? If it is so bad, why have all these countries ratified it?
Those countries want to dismantle the traditional perception of family in their countries. Բոլորը դա են ուզում, ավանդական պատկերացումը քանդել and become homosexual societies. I don't know. You should ask the demonstrators. But anyway, look, there's another question here. This convention, does it imply any changes in the education system, in the value system in education? Does it imply legal changes in Armenia?
So there is indeed in the convention a specific provision on education, which requests state parties, where necessary, to adopt certain measures that would help eradicate those gender stereotypes and those stereotyped prejudices that might lead to violence against women. So we always need to keep in mind what the purpose of the convention is. The purpose is really to combat violence against women. So if there are any stereotypes which might increase the probability of the violence.
Is that an imposition? Is that an imposition?
Can I just add? So we're talking about harmful stereotypes,
exactly.
Harmful traditional practices, because sometimes people think that we're saying tradition is bad. We're not saying tradition is bad, but we're saying that there are some harmful traditional practices, such as
honor killings.
Or
for instance, the tradition in some countries under which a husband is entitled to beat a wife. That used to be a legal provision in many legal systems across the world. And it also gave rise to a stereotyped understanding that it is indeed the right of the head of the family or of the father and the husband to discipline the kids and also the wife, and this obviously is a very unhealthy stereotype.
So it is saying that where there are these stereotypes that suggests that a man is superior to a woman, for example, that suggests that a man has certain rights to do things to women, that these type of stereotypes should be examined, and again, as I said before, that woman and man should be like this, not like this, but like this in a society, that they should be equal. Those are the stereotypes we're talking about. We're not talking about traditions in terms of in Christmas time. Do you eat turkey in Christmas time?
I don't think so.
In Armenia?
It's pork leg.
Pork, okay. So we're not talking about tradition of eating pork on Christmas time. We're not talking about, tradition of, tell me your traditions.
If I may add to that, because you asked whether there is any imposition of anything in the field of education, we need to keep in mind...
Is it a recommendation or is it an imposition?
We need to keep in mind that the convention was not drafted by bodies such as Grevio or the Venice Commission. It was drafted by states. So they themselves defined the provisions in such a way to accommodate their needs and interests. So if we look at the provision relating to education, it is drafted in a very soft language. So it says that states should adopt or shall adopt where necessary, or just to quote exactly, where appropriate, the necessary steps. And it's obviously left to each and every country to assess whether it is appropriate and what the necessary steps would be. So there are no concrete obligations. The states should assess the situation at home, and then, where appropriate, they should adopt necessary steps, and they will decide what the necessary steps would be.
Well, ladies, then when we don't have this traditional family thing about beating women. No, we love and respect women, indeed. So that's the tradition, and there are some crude people, and there are political interests. Right? There are political interests because we are in this paradoxic situation. The political party that took the political decision to adopt this convention now says this convention contradicts the national values. And back then, they intended to double-cross the Europeans, not to really ratify it. What do you say to that?
I will say again, this convention is about the women and the children who are experiencing violence. This convention is about helping, protecting, preventing your women in Armenia who are experiencing violence. I am not saying all women in Armenia are experiencing violence. I am not saying you have a tradition of men beating your women. God forbid you had that. I am not saying that. But I am saying that in your country, like in mine, like in hers, like in every country, there are women who experience violence. And it's not a joke. It's not a joke, and it should not be used as a political football. It is a serious issue, one which I personally feel very strongly about. It is about protecting the women and children. So let us protect them. Let us protect them. Let us not play games. This is not.
If I may, I would go one step further, and you already know what I will say. I think this convention is not only about women and children, but about a healthy society in which violence is not used as a tool to settle disagreements, disputes, etc. So in the end, the convention is just very good for the society as a whole. And if, as I indeed assume, violence against women is not part of a country's culture, then I would say that the convention promotes, rather than undermines in any way, national values. Then the convention is fully in line with the national values.
Well, it's clear that it gets politicized and it gets speculated. They're saying, the incumbent is doing this, and the opposition is using it against the incumbent, relying on feeding off of people's stereotypes. They say exactly that. This convention is contrary to our national values. And the people who say it are the ones who signed this convention back in the day. Fine, so if we adopt it, and if we don't adopt it, does it influence our relationship with the Council of Europe, and how?
If you adopt it, you will become part of the network, if you like, of the countries that have ratified the convention. This will help you in terms of practice exchanges, in terms of good practice sharing, in terms of being able to learn from others, in terms of being able to share your successes and your good practice. So it will be nice, right? It would be positive. But if you don't sign it, it does not affect your relationship with the Council of Europe. You are still a member of the Council of Europe. You will remain a member of the Council of Europe. So as such, in terms of how does it affect your relationship with the Council of Europe, there is no obligation. It is up to your sovereign state to decide whether or not
Definitely, but
to
if I
sign
may
it.
add to that, because you mentioned the practical dimension, I fully agree to what you've said, but there is also a symbolic dimension. After all, in 2011, when the convention was adopted, Armenia was one of the countries which contributed to this adoption, because the convention was drafted by the countries.
Sorry for interrupting you, Mrs. Bielkova. Quite often, the opponents say this. This is Europe imposing on us. And there isn't that consciousness that this is not, this is a Council of Europe document. And we are a member of the Council of Europe, so this is our document. It's not some foreigners imposing on us that document. That's often the interpretation.
Indeed, I would say that we, and that means the countries such as Armenia, such as the Czech Republic I come from, such as Malta, we are Europe. So we've prepared this document for our own societies. It's not something that would be imposed from outside, from any international institutions. That's a classical international treaty which was indeed drafted by national states. And going back to my previous point, so Armenia was one of those states, and if some years later it suddenly changes its mind and it does not see this instrument as worthy, then it sends an important signal which might be interpreted in very different ways. Let's leave it at that.
That we still want to beat our women. That's how it would be interpreted?
I leave it open I mean, depends on what explanation would be provided. It's not necessarily the only interpretation, but
I'm condensing the colors.
Yes, you would look at it the other way.
Yeah.
By ratifying it, you are giving a clear message that violence against women, domestic violence, is not acceptable.
Yeah.
So by ratifying, you are saying, we are clear, we acknowledge, we are saying zero tolerance, violence against women, domestic violence is not acceptable. So you are making that statement.
Generally, we're seriously combating the culture of violence because that culture exists for solving political disagreement, for other disagreement between men also. I think we need to see it in a general context of eliminating the culture of violence. Thank you so much, ladies, for that interesting conversation. The audience, we were talking to Veronika Bilkova, Venice Commission Vice President, Grevio President Marcelino. I should tell you that these ladies represent the Council of Europe, and these organizations were the ones that drafted and jointly with Armenia, with us, presented what we call the Istanbul Convention. In reality, the Convention against violence against women. We'll see you later. Goodbye.